There are two and only two ways that an economy can be organized. One is by freedom and voluntary choice, the way of the market. The other is by force and dictation, the way of the state. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone today. We will be talking with Professor Stephen Horwitz. He's the author of this great book, Austrian Economics, in Introduction. He is the Distinguished Professor of Free Enterprise in the Department of Economics in the Miller College of Business at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. He's also an affiliated senior scholar at the Mercatus Center in Arlington, Virginia, and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute of Canada. Mr. Horwitz, thank you for your time today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So before we critique anything, let's make sure we're on the same page. What is economics?
Well, all right. That's a broad place to start. It's interesting you asked that question because I just wrote a piece for libertarianism.org, or the Encyclopedia of Libertarianism, sort of a general piece on economics. And the best way for me to sort of think about economics is that anytime that human beings have to make choices, anytime that we face scarcity, we have to make choices, and those choices have costs. And what economics does is try to understand how people, when faced in situations of scarcity, make those choices and what the consequences of those choices are. And importantly, how social institutions like the market enable us to coordinate our activities nonetheless. I mean, we're all choosing individually in the face of our own perceptions of costs and benefits, but how does all that sort of come together and work for the benefit of everyone? That's what institutions of the market do. So one way to think about economics is we study how human beings engage in exchange under alternative institutions, alternative sets of rules.
That's so helpful to hear, considering I thought economics was just the Dow Jones and the World Bank and had nothing to do with me. That's why I was completely uninterested for my entire life until I got the foundational Austrian explanation. It seems like the Austrian school stands out so much in a lot of aspects. I'm curious, what makes the Austrian School of Economics unique among the Chicago schools, Marxist schools? What makes it unique?
Well, I think the big thing that Austrians are, sort of two things that Austrians are interested in. One is really taking seriously the idea that it's people's choices and it's our subjective assessments of the world that drive those choices as a sort of foundation of economics, that people don't know everything, and that we're acting on partial knowledge in the face of uncertainty, and we're trying to sort of stumble our way through the world and do the best that we can. I think that's one of the most, that piece is a key piece. And I think the other piece is the emphasis on processes. We're not interested in equilibrium stories. We're not interested in sort of solving for those defined equilibria. What we're interested in is sort of explaining how processes take place and how markets adjust and how people learn through the marketplace.
Okay, I'm curious, just like I had said previously, a lot of economics that I always thought was, well, what's the GDP? Once I get GDP, I know all there is to know. I'm curious, what is an accurate way of measuring wealth in a given society?
Well, that's an interesting question, right? I mean, we think of sort of the usual statistics we talk about. I mean, it's got a lot of imperfections, but sort of GDP per capita is useful in the sense that we know what that is. And we can compare it across societies, and we know that the problems with it are the same in every society. So certainly we think about sort of standard measures. But I think, rather than talk about wealth, maybe we can talk about progress, and we can talk about, for me, one of the indicators of just how well an economy is doing is how well it does by the least well off in that society. So if we have measures of what, say, poor people are able to consume and what they have in their households, if we think about things like literacy and life expectancy and all those kind of things, are all real indicators of just how wealthy and how well a society is doing. Wealth. Notice that wealth there isn't just material wealth. It's you can think of wealth as all the things that we value, and so. And I think progress for me is as good a word as any to talk about what I think we're getting at when we say how do we measure wealth and how do we compare societies in particular.
Why do you think some countries are wealthy and some countries are impoverished?
Well, that's about, as I was suggesting before, that's about the institutions or the rules of the game, right? I think one of the most important insights in economics is that people are people, right? What has sometimes been termed analytical egalitarianism, and this goes back to Adam Smith, that people are people. What explains the diversity among people is sort of the way in which we're brought up in the sort of worlds that we live in and so on. And what explains those differences across countries is what are the institutions under which people operate? Societies that protect private property, that have the rule of law, that have sound money, and also all the things we associate with the sort of liberal institutions are going to be societies that do better than ones in which private property is absent or interfered with a great deal. So when we want to make those comparisons, we want to look at those institutions, those practices, those rules of the games, including, I would add, sort of people's sort of philosophical standpoint or their ethical beliefs. You can have a society with the right institutions, but if people think making a profit's a bad thing, that those societies aren't going to work very well. And you also need the sort of ethical belief that it's okay to make a profit, it's okay to pursue your self-interest, those sorts of things too.
So, in other words, the reason that we see sort of this hockey stick of human progress, of very little progress for like, let's say, well, let's just go with 100,000
I'd say thousands of years, yeah.
thousands of years to be fair, and then it's like 1800 to the year 2000. In that 200-year period, it totally goes up. So you're saying, much like the Deirdre McCluskeys of the world, that it's not only economic freedom, but it's also social honor and the general recognition that investing, innovating is a good thing, and trading and exchange is not exploitation to be looked down upon, but a virtue to be admired and
That's
made.
right. That's right, and as McCloskey calls it, those are the bourgeois virtues, right? Those are those sort of belief in that ethical system. But also, the institutions matter too. I mean, I think McCloskey's work, she has tried very hard to emphasize the ethical piece because the focus has so heavily been on institutions. But I think you got to have both, right? You got to have both to work. And what we see, as you suggest, right, is humanity sort of riding along in misery for thousands of years. And then when we finally got the institutions right and we finally got the ethical beliefs right, 200, 250 years ago, guess what? Here we are. Things take off.
When I look at some major issues in America, I think of homelessness and lack of health care for a large segment of the population. I'm curious, so if my general desire is, or my question is, how can we increase access to those in lower income brackets over time while increasing quality, like we do with cell phones, computers, tablets, cars, etc.? Is that possible in all sectors? Is this something fundamental to how human beings operate? Or are there some sectors where the state needs to be involved, regardless of whatever fanciful ideas economists have?
I think you can do it in all those, and in any sector, right? Certainly in those two, for sure. If we think about housing and healthcare, and they're interesting examples because they're markets or industries in which markets are intervened in quite a bit by the state, and that sometimes makes things worse than they would be otherwise. But that said, right? I mean, I think it's important when we think about sort of healthcare, for example, to distinguish among health insurance, which not everybody has, and health care, which most people manage to get one way or the other. And it's even given all the interventions that we might think about, the advances in healthcare are over the last pick your number of years have been amazing, right? And people live longer lives and diseases are conquered in all kinds of ways, and stuff's actually cheaper. One of the reasons we spend so much in the aggregate on healthcare is that we have it to spend because some of the stuff is way cheaper than it used to be, and we can afford to spend on new or different treatments. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. That said, with healthcare, I think two things that we could do sort of as policy things that would help a great deal. One is to decouple health insurance from employment, right? The fact that you get your health insurance through your employer is a relic of government wage and price controls in World War II. And if we could break that link, and it's fairly easy to do, I think we'd see a whole bunch of new kinds of options come in. So that's one, but also on the supply side, we need to deregulate as well. We need to give doctors and nurses more freedom to do certain kinds of things, especially nurses who want to, say, prescribe, things like that. We want occupational licensure laws that make that more difficult. We want to open up interstate competition in the provision of insurance and other things. So there's all kinds of things we can do there to make those markets better. And similarly with housing, right? I mean, the story of the U.S. housing market is a fascinating one. Your listeners might want to look for the book by Rothstein called "The Color of Law," which traces through the history of how of the sort of racist intent and consequences of U.S. government housing policy. You want to explain why there's big differences, say, in black white housing ownership. This is the book to read to understand. If we want to expand home ownership to more people, getting rid of a lot of those regulations would help. And similarly, a lot of things like zoning and so on in cities that keep rents high are another reason why housing is so expensive. And that explains to some degree what we see in terms of homelessness and so on.
Yeah, that is something I even read Paul Krugman admit in Arguing with Zombies, that zoning drastically increases the price of housing. You also have people like Elvis Summers in California who made houses for the homeless at about $1,500 each. They were very nice. They were more or less boxes, but drastic improvements. Of course, the city shut it down, even though it was on private property, not regulated, because they, but they said it's okay because they're going to go through with a poverty bill that they have in Washington, D.C. A guy named Jay Austin did the same thing. They shut him down. It wasn't according to whatever regulation. Even though it's a drastic improvement, it's still not good enough. They'd rather shut it down and claim to be the heroes 10 years from now.
Right, and those innovations are great examples of how entrepreneurship and markets work to sort of provide those things that are otherwise missing.
Yeah, and then on healthcare, Dr. Mary J. Ruwart wrote a great book called Death by Regulation, and it's just fascinating that we could have so much innovation. It's not because there's too much freedom and voluntary exchange in these sectors. It's the introduction of coercion, as always. You mentioned in a great chapter in Austrian economics in introduction about 1974, I believe it was, where Friedrich Hayek, a member of the Austrian School of Thought, won the Nobel Prize for getting a foundational understanding of the business cycle, or why we experience recessions. Why do we experience recessions?
Well, at least what Hayek argued was that the recessions are the inevitable result of excessive money creation and credit expansion. So you have inflation. Inflation distorts prices. It distorts, in particular, the interest rate. It makes it look it makes the interest rate lower than it really is. It makes it look like people are more future oriented than they really are, and entrepreneurs start building longer processes of production, investing more in research and development and those sorts of things, anticipating that eventually the demand will be there. Turns out it's not going to be there. People's preferences haven't really changed. And so you get the boom as sort of everyone responds to those lower interest rates by building up production. And eventually the truth becomes revealed. And then you have the downturn into the recession. And what recessions are correcting the mistakes of the boom. And I think that's really important to understand. The mistakes get made during that inflationary period, and recessions are the way in which we correct that, what we call malinvestment, and try to get resources allocated back to where they will be more productive. So if you want to understand why recessions, at least most recessions, what we're seeing with COVID is a different story for a bunch of reasons. Why most recessions happen, one place to look is to see what's happening with inflation, and that's in our own era. That means looking at the Fed and other central banks, and it's their poor policies that are driving that process.
A general argument against free market economics is that some regulation, if not a large amount of regulation, needs to be introduced, where we would normally have this chaotic state of nature, man-on-man exploitation, no one really getting a fair shot, people constantly getting screwed. But then the state ushers in a regulatory regime under which people are able to engage in generally accepted commerce. Why are the Austrians so hesitant or outright opposing to state regulation?
Well, I think there's two sides to the story, right? One is an understanding of how markets work and why people have reasons to cooperate with each other, and an understanding that, in fact, much of the law that governs market transactions, commercial law, emerged out of these same sort of voluntary, emergent, spontaneous order processes that markets do, right? Nobody invented contract law. Nobody invented all that commercial law. Those are emergent orders, and they grew out of the needs of actual traders. So understanding, first of all, that law, that rules, and in that sense of the word regulation, right? You can have a regulated market in the sense of having one that abides by rules and laws without the state having to step in to do it is really important. So on one side, Austrians would say, well, look, there's ways for people to solve those problems and develop those rules by themselves to ensure that no one's getting screwed and that people are engaging in fair commerce. On the other hand, right, when you give the state the power to do these things, you have two issues. One, will politicians and political actors know what rules to adopt and what are the right solutions to these problems? The wisdom of crowds is better than the wisdom of a handful of people in Washington. And the other part, of course, is that do they have the incentive to do it right? And once you create those institutions of power, why should we be so confident that that power will be used the way we think it should be, as opposed to what's in the interest of those who possess it? And certainly the Trump administration has given us plenty of reason to believe that when you create institutions of power and you put the right or wrong person in it, they're going to be used and misused. And that's not a critique. That's not to say that the problem is bad people, right? The problem is you have these levers of power, and those levers of power will attract people who have an interest and a skill at using them, and particularly using them in problematic ways.
So Tom Hartman basically says there is one argument that really takes down both Chicago school and Austrian school economics. And it is that because they are foundationally unsound theories that assume human beings have perfect knowledge. Now, I've heard this criticism a number of times. I've never heard any Austrian or Chicagoan say, I know people have perfect information. However, this is the criticism. How do you respond to the mindset that what makes this a naive, unrealistic worldview is it assumes perfect information amongst consumers and employers and people across states and countries?
As a description of the Austrian school, it's just flat out wrong. That's the only, there's absolutely no substantive evidence to support that that's what Austrians believe. It's a little trickier with Chicago, right? But Austrians from the very start, including Karl Menger, whose work founded the school, the description of human beings have been, as I suggested earlier, of people who are imperfect, who don't know everything, who face uncertainty, who are engaged in market transactions as a way to learn and discover. That's, in fact, that's the core of the school, and that's the core of the whole, certainly for the Austrians, right? The core of the way we understand ourselves is to say that human beings don't have perfect knowledge. And in fact, that's interestingly, part of the reason why we're skeptical about government-imposed solutions is because political actors don't have perfect knowledge either, right? And it's not that we're saying they have perfect knowledge. They don't have perfect knowledge, but market participants do. Neither one does. The question is, under what sorts of rules and what sorts of institutions will imperfect, partially knowing human actors be better able to coordinate their behavior and produce progress? That's the question.
Yeah, that is a great article I came across by Don Boudreau, where he says, dumb individuals, brilliant voters, where people are so dumb that they can't be trusted with freedom. By the way, we need to vote. If you don't get active and participate, then you're the reason democracy isn't succeeding. It's like, well, if you can't trust them with their own judgment or the judgment that they delegate to an expert in the field, how can you trust them to vote for what, the head of the FDA?
Exactly.
The head of the
Mises makes this point too. Yeah, absolutely.
So another claim is that in this ideal framework of no coercive state intervention, you might have one, much like you have one playground on the bully, one wise, crack in the class. In a larger context, you would have a single monopolist in an industry. They would find some way to undercut the competition, buy them up because the competition's in a vulnerable situation, leave consumers and employees with very few choices. Once they're in that position, drastically raise the prices and leave the extremely vulnerable populace unable to have many alternatives and being exploited rather. Do you think the possible existence of monopolies is a weakness of the Austrian school?
Well, that scenario you lay out is what economists call predatory pricing, right? And there's a number of questions one could raise about it. I'll raise the sort of narrow one first, which is, well, wait a second. If predatory pricing behavior like that is how firms become monopolies, how do they get, in the first place, how do they get the sort of profits to be able to afford to quote undercut the competition for so long and take losses, right? That must have come from somewhere else. So it can't be an explanation of how firms become monopolies. And even if I recall the way you described it, suppose you have a monopoly, right? And then does these things. Well, wait a second. Suppose where'd that come from? And plus, if there's competition, it's not really a monopoly. I mean, a true monopoly means one, right? And we often see people today use the term monopoly to describe large firms. It doesn't mean large firm. It means one, mono, one, right? One and only one. So, but the bigger question, though, I think, is this. I often challenge students with this question, which is, give me a historical example of a company that acquired a monopoly without any help from the state, that through the market became the sole seller of a good, and when it became the sole seller, raised prices and restricted output, because that's what theory says it should do. And I submit there's no such example, at least in American history. The examples that we sometimes think of as monopolies either were monopolies that were granted by the state. Example would be AT&T in its early years was given a state monopoly over the telephone. U.S. Postal Service monopoly over first-class mail. Okay, so those are examples of state-granted monopolies, and any other market ones. And there's a few that are pretty close, where firms were nearly single sellers. Right, for a while, Microsoft was in certain markets, but again, it's not like they raised their prices and restricted output. To the contrary, right? They gave their software away for free, right? And lots of people used it. So the question is, show me an example of a market-created monopoly that behaved poorly in the way that models say. The real problem with monopoly is when states grant privilege to particular producers and insulate them. That privilege insulates them from competition. That's the real problem. That's when they're able to raise prices and restrict output and so forth.
Could we possibly maybe experience something like what's referred to as pooling, where there is a general meeting of the minds amongst competitors, that it's mutually beneficial if they all artificially price high in order so not one of them wins over the other, but they engage in I'm sorry, what is it? I think it's called
Cartel.
Cartel.
Cartel,
Okay.
yeah.
Cartelling. Is the possible existence of market cartels a weakness of the Austrian school?
So the question you have to ask here is such a cartel, again, without support from the state, in the interest of the participants, right? You can each of them might say, well, sure, yeah, if we get together and we agree on to restrict output and raise price, we can all benefit from it. But notice that each of the members of the cartel has an incentive to break that agreement, right? What they want to be able to do is have everyone else charge the high price while they actually find a way to increase production and offer the good at a lower price. That's in their incentive to do that. And if each of those cartel members has that same incentive, right, the cartel just falls apart. So one of the problems you face with cartels is, how do you ensure that the agreement holds? How do you get people to act in ways that are clearly against their self-interest? And that's why there too, I think there's very few examples, if any, of truly market-driven cartels lasting for any real period of time.
It's amazing that all these creative criticisms they find under the deep microscope, they never apply to the state. It's like, okay, how about the government's $1 trillion a year military that makes us less safe, creates enemies, and funds jihadis to fight Assad and fight Gaddafi? How about the $22 trillion welfare state that hasn't solved poverty, even though they promise it's going to? Medicare, Medicaid have not solved the problem of healthcare. Every time, there's a bill, they have to make 10 more bills to make up for the last one they screwed up. They never apply this consistently, which the Austrians uniquely do. And that's another strength I think the Austrians have.
I think just as a general point, right? Critics talk about market failure all the time, that markets don't live up to what the model says they should do. But we also have to talk about government failure, right? And does government do what we say it should do and solve the problems that, as you say, problems it claims it's solving?
Yeah, and at least with the market, you can opt out. It's like every criticism of the market applies tenfold to the state, because you can always opt out of funding whoever it is in the marketplace. Speaking of funding only who you want to, you open the book talking about subjective value. Why is subjective value an important concept?
Well, we have to understand if we want to understand behavior in the marketplace, we have to understand how individuals choose and the choices that they make and so on. And that the start of, as back to McCloskey, as she says, economics is what happens between your ears, right? In that it's people's perceptions of the world that drive their actions. And so economic value, when we think about economic value, is, do people think something is useful to them? Do they think that this particular good will satisfy a particular want that they have? That's where economic value comes from our perceptions of it, and how each person's perceptions of value interact with each other and with people who want to sell goods determines market outcomes. I mean, the subjective theory of value was the correct response to previous theories of value, like labor theory of value or other what we call cost of production theories of value, which could not explain observed phenomena in the real world. but the subjective theory of value could.
Now, you mentioned the labor theory of value. I have one general response that I could see coming from the labor theory of value advocates, from Adam Smith to Richard Wolff today, that not all labor is value. For example, I dig a hole, fill it back up, 8 hours a day. That's not value. But all value is labor. In other words, this very book only has value to me because someone put the labor, you plus the manufacturer, put the labor into it to make it for me so I could enjoy it. Therefore, the labor theory of value is accurate because all value comes from labor.
You're thirsty, and you're walking along the street, and you see a unstarted bottle of water sitting right there. Right? Or better yet, here's a better, actually, let's do a better example. You're walking through forest and you're thirsty, and there's a stream running through the forest, and you decide to take some of the stream water and drink it, right? You value that. There's no question that stream water has value for you, right? Yet it's not clear there was any labor that went into producing it, right? Part of the problem with one problem, and not the biggest problem, but one problem with the labor theory of value is, how do you explain things like that? How do you explain goods that sort of the goods of nature that no labor went into, that nonetheless clearly have value to us?
Sure. And the fact that I value, paying for this book and spending time to read it, whereas, I know other people who hate libertarianism in the Austrian school who wouldn't spend a penny on it and wouldn't read it.
Well, luckily for them, they can download it for free at Cato, so they don't have to spend anything but their time.
Oh, terrific! Very nice. So I want to get into chapter 3 a little bit more: spontaneous order. What is the principled and practical difference between a corporation engaging in centrally planning, for example, Doug McMullen or Jeff Bezos, the CEOs, sort of centrally planning and then delegating until they have, the average person in Chandler, Arizona? What is the principal difference between that central planning and government central planning?
That is a great question, and I think one that I wish people would ask more. So, a couple of things. First of all, those organizations, firms, corporations, whatever, exist in an environment that has two features to it. And that is, first, it is an environment of competition. There are other firms doing this, engage in the same thing. Amazon does have competition. Other firms have competition. So they always have to pay attention to that. And people have choices about whether or not they want to patronize those firms. But more important, they operate in an environment that has prices and profits and markets and so on that enable them to plan within their organizations. So Amazon can formulate a budget, can see profits and losses, and can figure out whether it did things right, and determine whether within their organization what path forward they want to take. So ironically, what enables firms to plan is the planlessness of the market environment in which they operate, right? You can't engage in that planning within a firm unless you have markets outside of the firm. If we think about the state trying to plan everything, there's no outside for it to use. There's no prices, there's no profits, there's no market for it to rely on to engage in that planning. That was the sort of the original Marxian vision. So you can't, you can't plan everything, but the fact that you can plan in those smaller organizations is made possible by the planlessness of the broader environment in which it operates. And it's important to remember that when we talk about things like spontaneous order, that the actions that the individual people and firms and households are taking are sort of rational, planned actions. It's not, my students want to translate spontaneous order as shit happens, but that's not right, okay? People make very conscious, intentional decisions. The outcome of the back and forth of those decisions is no one's plan, no one's intention, is emergent in that sense. But the actual decisions of the individual actors and firms and so on, very much rational and planned. And they can do that because they're operating within that broader market context.
Sure. You wrote a paper some time ago called Competitive Currencies, Legal Restrictions and Origins of the Fed, Some Evidence from the Panic of 1907.
Yeah, 30 years ago. That's a long time. That's a long time ago.
I'm curious, when we look at something like competitive currencies,
Yep.
Is it possible that spontaneous order, so I'm sorry to ask this in a roundabout way. When we think of money, it's generally 1913 Fed is granted a monopoly on the currency. The state therefore provides a monopoly on the currency as a generous favor to us in order so that we all have a common currency that we can easily trade with, much like the European Union does with the euro. When it comes to something like currency, why should we look to spontaneous order and not the Federal Reserve Bank?
Well, again, sort of same, I think, strategy to the response. One is we have historical evidence of how currency money produced by the marketplace works just fine. The period, I mean, the best example of this, by the way, is Canada. Canada had market-generated currencies, competitive currencies for most of the 19th and into the 20th century. It was remarkably free of the sorts of problems that we've that the United States and other countries had. So we know it's not just theory. We also know that in Great Britain, for a long stretch of time, competitive currency worked. So we have the historical evidence that shows that it's working. At the same time, we have also historical evidence of the failures of central banks, right? The instability in the US economy in the 20th century has been much greater than it was previously. We never saw the inflation that we've seen. We certainly didn't have a Great Depression or a Great Recession, right, in the 19th century. So why think that spontaneous ordering processes can do better by money? We have theory that suggests it's, same sort of stories we tell about competition in markets, but we also have plenty of history that indicates that markets work in money, that competition works in money, and that government intervention fails. I should add that that one can tell a story about the failures in the United States in the 19th century, the panics and so on. The story one can tell there is clearly one in which the federal government's intervention was the primary cause for those problems.
Yes. It's kind of the same question, but this is still a really important aspect, because when we think of law, legality, what the law and legislation is, we often think of, well, law is that which is discussed in society, deliberated in Congress and then passed in DC, and then distributed amongst the states. You wrote a paper, Spontaneity and Design in the Evolution of Institutions, the Similarities of Money and Law. Do we have any reasonable justification or historical justification for seeing why law and legal rules in a society could actually evolve spontaneously as opposed to being written down by congressmen?
As we were talking about earlier, the entirety of commercial law and so forth, the common law, all emerged. Nobody designed it any more than someone designed the English language or anything else. Common law, commercial law emerged out of a centuries-long process of judges deciding cases and setting precedent, and then new cases come up and decisions are made and new precedents are set. And what we call the common law, the commercial law, is the accumulation of all that wisdom over time. So we already live in that world, right? It's not even a question. We already live in a world in which much law, not all, as you say, there's this important difference between that and sort of administrative law legislation, but where much of the law, again, commercial law is the best example of this. The law that governs commercial transactions was not invented by anybody. It wasn't given to us by the state. It emerged out of what we call judge-driven processes.
So while we have a general idea of spontaneous order and ideal cooperation, we do have, things like pandemics or hurricanes. And you wrote a paper called Walmart to the Rescue, Private Enterprises Response to Hurricane Katrina. I'm curious, maybe you could have, when everything's going fine, we could have freedom, but when something bad happens, obviously we need to usher in a totalitarian state.
It seems like it the last few months, especially if you live in Australia.
Yeah, really. Does the existence of pandemics, terrible things, justify the existence of a coercively interventionist state?
Not in and of themselves. I will, a couple things, right? These kind of examples, large-scale natural disasters or a pandemic, right? Certainly public health things like a pandemic are probably about the best argument you're going to get for some role for the state. But whatever that role is, right, it doesn't, it's certainly not all-encompassing, and it certainly doesn't have to be, the lockdowns, for example, I think people were critical at the time, and now I think we certainly know after the fact, were probably not necessary. There were other paths forward we could have taken without driving a stake through the economy. So there's no reason to think that sort of any kind of, broad scale, large scale government intervention is necessary. I mean, given that government has the role it plays in the societies we exist in, right? You can talk about certain things government might do to ensure public health and to keep pandemic under control. Things like testing and so on like that. Okay, fine. But that's a whole different story than saying, then sort of turning into de Blasio or Andrew Cuomo or which is Andrews, I think is his name in Australia. So right. That's a whole different thing.
One trend that I see among Austrians uniquely, especially, is what you could refer to as, I believe Hans Hoppe calls it, a priori reasoning, or along with Mises. I believe in, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the book. But they engage in a lot of a priori reasoning to get an understanding of more complex ideologies, starting with, of course, in human action, humans act. Then they engage in ranking cardinal ordinates of, how they value certain things. Why is there such a focus on a priori reasoning as opposed to empirical evidence or data from the Federal Reserve?
Well, first of all, a couple of things. I think two things. I think that Mises has been misunderstood on this question. This notion of a priori reasoning doesn't mean you sit in your armchair at home and invent economics and suddenly you know everything. What Mises was saying was there are a few things that we know about human beings because they're fundamental to the way the human mind works, that humans act and that we rank order things. And sort of there's a core, right, that we know, and he said we know through introspection. That's how human beings work. And I would add, by the way, now we know enough about how brains work and evolution to sort of say, it's not just introspection. We have some evidence to suggest that human beings have commonalities for biological, physical reasons. But there's a limited number of things, right? Economics is to take those things and say, all right, what's the real world we're operating in? What are the actual institutions we face? What are the people like in that world? And sort of applying it there. And I think that this notion that Austrians reject empirical evidence and so on it's just factually wrong. I mean, Theory of Money and Credit, Reese's first big book, right, was all kinds of historical evidence about the roles of money and so on. And I think other Austrians, certainly modern Austrians, myself and people who are sort of doing this work today, don't reject data and empirical evidence. We don't even reject econometrics necessarily, as long as it's used to sort of support and supplement the argument rather than being the focal point. I wrote a piece as part of a Cato Unbound back in 2012 on, I think if you search Horwitz, Cato praxeology, you'll find it, that sort of lays out this point, right? So I think Austrians did and continue some to do themselves no good by sort of insisting on this sort of a priori nonsense. It's just not how we do things. And importantly, Mises never, even when he talked about praxeology, never said I'm sort of inventing something new and something out of my mind. He was describing what he believed good economists had always done and just trying to put a name to it and systematize it in certain sorts of ways. So I think this is a really misunderstood thing. And it's important because what we don't want to be, Austrians don't want to be perceived as is sort of saying, well, we know all the answers to all these policy questions because we just sat around and man acts and we deduced from there. That's not how it works.
Sure. What would you say are the best real world examples of free markets increasing the amount of wealth of the least well off in a given society?
Well, I think a couple of things. You can look at the Census Bureau tracks data on what percentage of households own certain basic appliances and so on, and you can look at that and sort of see that poor Americans below the poverty line today live as well as the average American did in the 1970s, right? So that's one way to measure it. I think in general, consumption is a good way to measure these things because that's what we care about. We care about what are people able to buy with the money that they earn. And so looking at something like that, I've done this work that sort of looks at a number of hours people have to work to buy certain kinds of things, and you can look at that and sort of see that people are able to obtain things today with much less work than they were years ago. You can look at the percentage of people's income they spend on food, shelter, and clothing. Used to be about 75% 100 years ago. It's about half that today. So there's all these different kinds of ways. Again, as I suggested earlier, I think you can look at these at things like life expectancy and literacy and all those sorts of things too. Cheap antibiotics are available to people in ways that they didn't used to be. That's a dramatic improvement in the lives of the least well off. The fact that this is one of my favorite stories, that 3/4 of poor American households have at least one car, right? That's amazing. And the story I like to tell is, I think I got this from McCloskey. Also, we've been talking about her a bunch today. But back in the 1940s, the Soviets decided to show the film version of The Grapes of Wrath as anti-capitalist propaganda. If you know the story, right? The family of Okies is driven out by the Dust Bowl. They get in their old car. They drive to California. Terrible things happen to them, and so on. And it was an anti-capitalist sort of polemic's too strong of a word, but certainly anti-capitalist. And so they showed the film as propaganda, and they had to stop after a week. Why? Because the Russian audiences were watching and going, whoa, wait a second. Poor Americans have cars, right? This is 1940. So again, those kind of measures, I think, are really important. But along with, again, literacy and access to medicine and life expectancies and so forth.
One of the major critiques that I have come across about the Austrian school is that it focuses too much on wealth. For heaven's sake, it's not just about money and consumption. What we also need to focus on is living a fulfilled life. We need to have a society with a high amount of social trust where people also feel fulfilled with dignity. The market doesn't do that. The state, as my representative, has the ability to do that. Therefore, this is a major hole in the Austrian school. How do you respond?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, the evidence that the state's able to do that, I'm not sure where that is, and why. It's interesting, isn't it, that many of the same people who might make that kind of argument are now out marching in the streets all upset because the state's locking up people in jail for doing nothing wrong, right? That's the state, right? And if why is it that you trust the same people who you think will who you're so upset about having all these powers to do all this harm, to suddenly turn around and be able to do good? That's that's part of it. But I also think there's a more fundamental flaw in that argument, which is Austrians, libertarians even, but certainly Austrians don't believe that wealth is about material goods. It's about all the things. Your wealth is all the things that you value. So and that's subjective value, right? So if you value peace and quiet, that's having a peaceful, quiet environment is part of your wealth. If you think the world is impossible to imagine without music, having music is part of music for you is a form of wealth. And that's we teach that. We should be teaching that anyway. Day 1 or 2 in Econ 101. That's from the start. It's, as we were saying before, it's not about financial and material stuff, or at least not about that alone. So I think sort of the charge that somehow we're not concerned with those other things is just wrong. And at the end of the day, the way you're able to live a life of dignity and able to sort of live a life of comfort and all the things that people are talking about is you have to have the material resources to do it. And nothing has provided those material resources better for the least well off for the last several hundred years than markets have. And to me, that's the response.
There is an interesting book, I think it's called Wages, Unemployment, and Recessions by Mises, where he has like a chapter that's like 2 paragraphs long on why wages rise, I think is the title of it. I'm curious, how would you summarize why wages rise?
2 things. First of all, what matters for wages are the productivity of labor, right? How productive we are as workers, and the productivity of the capital that we work with. So why have wages risen? One reason is that we have better capital to work with. Machinery, technology, and so on has made the average, even if producer productivity doesn't change, if labor productivity doesn't change, right? We're working with better equipment than we used to. We can produce more than we used to. But it's also the case, human beings have more education, more training, more knowledge than they used to. We are, even if the capital had remained the same, we ourselves have more productive skill than we used to. And the combination of those 2 things is what drive wages. So when I say to my students, you want to earn a good living, what do you need to do? 1, you need to have human capital. You need to have your own skills. But 2, you got to find an industry to work in where people value the output and where the capital that you're working with will make you productive.
Yeah, that was definitely laid bare to me one day when our computer system went down
Right.
at work, and we had to do like everything over the phone and
There we
on
go.
and pen and paper. And we did it, but we helped probably 1/50th of
Right.
the customers we otherwise would. So we were 1/50th as productive. No wonder our wages
Yep.
are much higher than they otherwise
That's right.
would be because of that. Yeah.
That's right, and that's a really good example, right? That sort of, and notice too, in the old days, you would have had a lot more workers, right? Your labor capital ratio would have been very different. The way you would try to serve those customers is by having lots of people writing stuff down by hand, right? But and what technology, what good capital does, is to make enable a smaller number of workers to produce the same or more output, freeing that other labor to produce other things that we want. People talk about how supposedly American manufacturing is, not what it used to be because all the number of manufacturing jobs has dropped. Well, that's true, but manufacturing output's still going up. We're able to produce more with fewer people. That's a good thing, not a bad thing.
That's another great insight of the Austrians, is that they don't look at people as, well, as a worker, you're getting screwed because you lose your job. They're able to see competitors as potential options, and they look at this individual as a person who's also a consumer. So while your job might be at risk, when everyone's job is constantly innovating, well, you have access to products and services way more than you otherwise would because of this competition.
That's right.
Yes, the cost is it threatens your job, but the benefit is all the access to products and
That's
services.
a that's a really good way to look at it, which is to say it's the same phenomena. The things that make your job risky and run the risk of losing it are the exact same things that enable you to consume all that stuff and live a life of comfort. That's exactly right.
Now, in a lot of economic discussions, it seems like you'll hear the Austrian or the Chicagoan say something about a general idea of how to get prices lower and why regulation stifles innovation. And then you have someone else who says, well, instead of doing all this mess, we should make things free. Now, by free, they mean the state should coercively collect the funds and disperse them. How do you communicate to someone who just has the mindset of things can be free if it wasn't for these idiot libertarians making it so they charge us for things? Just make them free. Make college free, cancel debt, cancel rent, cancel mortgage, and make healthcare free as well.
Well, one, I wish I knew the easy answer to that question. I think you have to talk about the fact that resources are scarce, that there is no such thing as free, right? Everything has a cost, and it's just a matter of who or what's going to bear that cost. So you can't, free college, it doesn't mean it might be free to you in the sense of that you're not paying dollars to get there, but someone has to provide the resources to provide that to you, which means someone else doesn't have the resources to do another thing. So the decisions we make about where to allocate resources, should we have provision of more college services? Should we have more food, more medical care, whatever? We need some way of sorting that out, right? And that's what prices do. And that's, the chapter in the book on the socialist calculation debate, it talks all about that. And so I think, one of the questions you can ask people when they make that argument, or at least one of the things you say, is to remind them that resources used for one thing are resources taken away from another. How are you going to decide? How do you know which things are more important than others? And more importantly, how do you know who's going to produce them and who's not? And then you got to answer all kinds of questions. Okay, free college. What kind of college? Liberal arts college, right? Technical college. What? Right? We're going to provide people with free, nails and hammers. Okay, what size nails? What size hammer? How do we have medical care? Is the best example. We're going to provide people with free medical care. Right? Government's going to provide, well, okay, what kind of medical care? How many doctors? How many nurses? What sorts of things? What sorts of drugs? All of those detailed questions, without markets to guide you, without what Mises called the aids to the mind of prices and profits, you can't figure that out, right? I won't put something like this in an article on this, but people accuse libertarians of having no heart, but in fact, replacing the market with the state is more like gouging out your eyes, right? That you can't see, you can't figure out what you need to do. And in order to care about the least well off, in order to sort of expand opportunities for more people, you need to be able to use resources effectively, and you need to be able to see where people's priorities are. And that's what markets help us figure out.
It's so incredible that these statists just give us those objections, totally ignoring the pile of bodies that governments have murdered over the last century. How about since the days of like ancient Egypt, all the enslavement, mass murder, and they're like, oh, you guys, your philosophy doesn't care about people.
Yeah.
What?
Well, and notice too, right? That some of that argument is what's interesting about it to me is that they are the ones that are focused on the material. They can only see sort of costs and wealth, to go back to our other conversation, right? In terms of material stuff, and that's what so they're accusing us of being focused only on that, but to them that's what it is. I mean, in a way, right? They're the ones who are saying that's what it is, and we have I think, much broader vision. Austrians have certainly a much broader vision of what constitutes wealth, right? And when we talk things about we say things about scarcity and cost, we're not just thinking of physical material things. We're recognizing that human beings exist in a world where we cannot get everything that we want, and so we have to make choices.
Um, People often describe competition as very dog eat dog, this primitive, I'm going to get you, I'm going to undercut you, I'm going to do anything I can so I could win. When I win, you lose. That's competing like a basketball game. You describe competition very differently in Austrian economics and introduction, where you say it's much more of a process. How is competition not like a dog eat dog win lose situation, but more of a process?
Well, I think I'm not sure that process is the right sort of comparison to dog eat dog, but I certainly think one of the things when we talk about economic competition, the way it differs from other forms of competition is that it's positive sum, right? The competition if you think about, someone has to win and someone has to lose a baseball game, okay? There's a winner and a loser. If we think about, competition, biological competition, right? You survive or you don't. But in economic, physically survive. But economic competition, the competition among firms, it might be that one firm wins out in the competition, the other firm loses, but we all win as consumers, to go back to your point from earlier, right? We all win as consumers because that's the process, right? It's through that process that prices are driven down, that goods become more affordable, and so on. So sort of the notion of I mean, good competition should be dog eat dog, should be intense and rivalrous. But the point is that one, we've moved from a world for most of human history where competition was literally life or death. Now it's not literally life or death. It's does your firm survive or not? And two, it produces benefits for other people. And let me make another point here too. I think that libertarians need to talk more about the ways in which markets are about cooperation as much as they are about competition. What happens in marketplaces is that we cooperate with each other, right? Producers and consumers cooperate. When you go into the store to look for that can of Coke, it's there waiting for you, right? When you want something from Amazon, you get it, okay? And that's that cooperation, the fact that we are able to engage with each other in these peaceful, productive, positive some ways, is an amazing thing. Under that is the competition, right, that we're just talking about. But what that does is create this world of social cooperation, and I think we don't talk about it enough in those terms.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like you do see Olive Garden competing with Red Robin, competing with TGI Fridays. But if you just go into the Olive Garden, everything that's there took hundreds of people to cooperate just there, getting
Right.
into the eye pencil
And
phenomenon of,
that's
just the
right.
napkin alone took 1 million people to make.
And if they drive Red Robin out of business, nobody dies, right?
Yeah.
The resources that were used to be for Red Robin now can be used for something else, right? And that's the difference between sort of what people think about as sort of biological competition or even athletic competition or military competition, right? Which are negative, at best zero, but negative sum games.
What do you think the great intellectual contribution of Eugene Baumbawerk was to the Austrian school and society at large?
Well, I think most economists would know him from his stuff on capital and interest, and I think that's probably the right answer. And he really formulated the first systematic explanations of capital and interest after the marginalist revolution and after, so within the Austrian tradition. And almost anyone who writes on that has to deal with it. I mean, there were errors in it. We've improved upon it over time, but certainly that was his fundamental contribution to economics.
So if I seek out employment for an employer and the employer makes $50 an hour off my labor, but only pays me $20 an hour, is this a form of unjustified exploitation?
If you're really producing $50 worth of value for that employer, but he or she's only paying you 20, okay, two things are true. There is another employer somewhere else who is making $50 off $50 total off you, who could profit by paying you 25 or 30, right, and still make the difference, make $20 or whatever as the difference. So why wouldn't that other employer step in and offer you the better deal? And then secondly, why wouldn't you go searching for it if you were, you should be able to say to that other employer, look, I'll come work for you, right? I can produce $50 worth of value. They're only paying me 20. What will you pay me? And it should be in theory worth them to pay up to $49.99. They're still making a penny, a profit off of what you're doing. So why firms would consistently pay workers less than the value that they produce is not clear in a competitive market.
Sure. And I just want to get to the heart of your discussion on entrepreneurship.
I've just got about a couple more minutes. So.
Oh, yes. Okay. Last question. Just when talking about entrepreneurship, is it inherently exploitative? The fact that I use you to make more money, even if I have 50 competitors and you can maybe get a better deal elsewhere, are we still dealing with me using you to make money off of you so you can make money for me, the fat cat?
But what's the using there, and what's the making money off me? If it's a mutually beneficial transaction, right? You're paying me for my labor, right? And I'm providing value to you. You're in a position. Go back to our earlier conversation. You as the owner are in a position of having capital that makes my labor more valuable than it would be otherwise. Remember, as a worker, I need capital. As a capitalist, you need workers, right? And so are there differences in bargaining power? Sure. But the fact that workers in a competitive market economy can exit and find other options is important. And if they don't think they're being paid fairly, there are other options out there. All the firms got together and keep wages down. Well, we went through that with our discussion of cartels, right? The incentive for any individual to break that agreement is still pretty high. So there's nothing. I mean, to claim that it's inherently exploitative, I think in the end, sort of from a Marxian perspective, is going to have to rest on something like the labor theory of value, which we know is false.
Of course, and sometimes it's the other way around. When the business might go under, well, then a lot of the employees have more leverage at that time. Yeah. When I, as a consumer, go into a place, I'm not looking to meet the employees and fulfill their lives. I'm doing it because I want a product, I want a service, just like they do when they come into my store. Nothing wrong with this voluntary commercial interaction.
And notice
where both parties benefit.
Right, and notice that the focus there is almost always on entrepreneurs who profit. Right. What about
not the loss?
Yeah, the losses. Yeah. I mean, how do you talk about that?
Excellent. Stephen Horwitz, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. The book is
pleasure.
Austrian Economics, an Introduction, something I absolutely recommend.
As I said, you can find a downloadable version at libertarianism.org at the Cato Institute's website. You can also find there are 7 video lectures that accompany it that sort of correspond to the various chapters. So that's another thing. If you're interested, you can go take a look at those as well.
Terrific. You will find all those links in the description below. Mr. Horwitz, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Happy to be here, Keith. Thanks for having me.